So hello everyone, welcome to INSEAD. Really a pleasure to have you all here today with us. Um, this is a session about Giga and the Giga case, and I'm delighted that we have, my name is Felipe Montero, I'm a strategy professor here at INSEAD, and I'm delighted that today we have the full research team with us. I'll introduce them in a second. So before we go and we talk about Giga, let's just go through some webinar etiquette. And as I guess a lot of you might be familiar with, this is in a webinar, you're muted, the video is off, and the chat's closed, but the Q&A is open. So there's a Q&A tab that you can suggest questions for, for the case protagonist, for any of us. And please feel free to do so throughout the webinar. And an interesting feature, right, you can vote up the questions. So when we go through later on for the Q&A, we can see what are the questions that resonate with most of you. So this webinar is being recorded. It's going to be posted later on. And if there's any technical issues, there's an email there, digital@insead.edu. This is the place that you can email if you face any technical issues. So what is the topic today and what is the case today? I'm not sure how many of you had heard about Giga before this webinar today or before receiving this invitation. Fascinating organization. It's interesting because a lot of us are hearing and talking about AI, OpenAI, and DeepSeek, and a lot of this, and a lot of conversations about technology and digital. Today, our focus is on this, but how technology and digital can impact education and can impact the lives of hundreds of millions of people in different parts of the world, and especially those parts of the world that really need that. And kind of Tina, Katya, and I, we went to Giga, and Chris was super open in terms of opening up, and we wrote this case, right? And which I understand you have access to, which is published by INSEAD. And what is this case about? Okay, and if you can go to the next slide, Sandra. What is this challenge, right? And there is about more than 500 million students with no access to internet. Uh, so you have an idea of what could this impact in terms of their education, right? And to a large extent, what's going to be the future professional lives, so on and so forth. And I here, as typically at INSEAD, I know there are people connecting from all over the world. If you see this table, which is kind of exhibit one in the case, you see what are the areas of the world where you have more population without access to the internet. And then the big challenge, how can you connect them? What can be done, right? And there's might be some expectation this is all the work of governments. But I think in the context of Giga, and if we can go to the next slide, what we see is how Giga, as a startup and in the United Nations ecosystem, right, sponsored by UNICEF and ITU, how can they help increasing that connection, right? And you see the mission here is not a timid mission, right? It's quite bold. It's how you connect every school in the world to the internet by 2030, which is 5 years from now, and every young person to information, opportunity, and choice. And some of you may have recognized the map here. So if we zoom in, and again, this isn't the case, this is Colombia. And then you see what you have there, and you see the challenges, right, of getting all those schools. So the red dots are schools which are not connected. How do you connect them? Next slide. So what is the vision here? Vision is every child and adolescent have access to universal school connectivity, which for many parts of the world, right, where I'm connecting and many a number of you are. This is take for granted. Yes, our children have access to school, but this is not true all over the world. And how you can make this a foundation for programmatic interventions and somehow an integral part of realizing the UNICEF strategic goal. And the statement or the outcome statement is, by 2028, in 3 years' time, 200 million learners connected, all schools globally, which approximately 6 million are successfully mapped. Next slide, please. And you will hear much more from Chris in a second, but this is, if we were to summarize, how Giga works, right? And it's interesting because there is a lot which comes to how do you build this infrastructure, this technical infrastructure to make it work. So first, how do you map the locations of the schools? And the connectivity status was not only being connected, but really having access to the internet. And then how do you model infrastructure, policies, regulations, investments that are needed to deliver school connectivity? Then how do you work with governments to build the right layered financing to pay for that? And then how do you help governments contract for connectivity? So you clearly see here, right? We are talking about that intersection of technology, digital education, governments with a huge impact in many parts of the world that really need that. Just before moving on, just setting the context. So in Seattle, right, I'm the academic director of the Global Talent Competitiveness Index. So every year we rank countries according to the competitiveness of the talent, and it's very clear to us over time, right? We've been doing this for 10 years, that the gap in terms of talent only increases between the most developed countries and the least developed ones. So if you go to the origins of that, a lot of it is related to education or access to education. So that initiative by Giga, I think, is fundamental to close that gap. So you are here not here to hear from me, but to hear from the protagonist. So let me introduce to you who is here with us in the team. So if I could invite, Chris, Katya, and Tina just to turn on the cameras. So you see who is here. So the case protagonist is Chris Fabian. So he's a co-founder, co-lead of Giga, and he's gonna share kind of first-hand experience, how he's been doing it, what works, what doesn't work, the challenges ahead. And Katya Tatarinov, who is a professor, assistant professor of strategy at HC Lausanne, and also co-founder of Hoja AI. She will interview him. She has a number of questions, and she's going to kickstart the discussion. And later on, Tina Ambu, who's a professor of international management at the University of Geneva, will go and see all the questions that you put in the Q&A, and then moderate this final Q&A question. So thanks for joining us, and let me now stop and hand it over to Katya and Chris for the initial conversation. Katya, over to you.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Excellent introduction. Today, I'd like to take the next 30 minutes with Chris and really go over three main areas of discussion. I think we'll start with obviously technology and how we're using technology to address societal problems. Then we'll talk about cross-sector collaboration. There's quite a few of our audience online from private sector as well, so maybe understanding how they can work with Giga and how Giga has been able to set up such a vibrant ecosystem of partners, and finally get really tangible with some of the maybe not so great things that have happened at Giga and how you've learned from them over the years. To start, maybe I'll tell a story of the first time I heard about Giga, which was sitting down with Chris in an office here in 2019 in Geneva. At the time, Chris was living in New York, running the innovation unit at UNICEF. And he pulled out a napkin, and on the table on this napkin, he drew out this incredibly ambitious plan, and it turned into a circle. And he said, to start, we're going to focus on just the first part of this plan, which is mapping all the schools in the world. And then we're going to do this and that and this and that. And I remember sitting there, my head almost kind of exploding by the time he got to the end of the circle, thinking, this is so ambitious. I cannot possibly imagine how Chris is going to achieve this. Of course, I already held him to a lot of high esteem, but even then, I thought this was such an ambitious plan. And it's been quite incredible to see over the last 5 years what Chris and his team, UNICEF and ITU, have achieved together, to see Giga founded, to see Chris move over to Geneva, set up the headquarters here and in Barcelona, and now to read some of the statistics online, 2.4 million children connected, over nearly 6,000 schools, and maybe those statistics have even changed more recently. So just to see this grow has been really, really amazing, and to follow this both from an academic as well as more and more involved perspective. So maybe if we can take it back to start, Chris, could you tell us about the vision? Can you share the story behind Giga's founding, how this started, and why this is such an important mission to connect every child to the internet?
Thanks so much, Katya. And that's a really kind introduction. And thank you also to INSEAD and to Felipe for kicking this off and hosting us in this discussion. I mean, Katya, I think both you and Tina have been so instrumental to our welcome into Geneva as well. So a lot of things come together in this conversation, and really looking forward to dive into all of them. I think that Giga started off like most things from a need. I think most things that people build, most companies and projects start from some sort of personal need. And for us, I was running the innovation fund at UNICEF, as quasi venture fund. It did grant-based financing to early stage GovTech startups, sort of in the range of $100,000 of equity-free funding. And we were investing and we're putting money into these companies in emerging markets that were like a drone company in Malawi, a chatbot in Cambodia, all these things that could help governments do their job better. And they kept not scaling. They kept, like, they would hit these certain blocks, these certain barriers. And this is maybe 2015, 16. We kept, trying to figure out, well, how do we make these portfolio companies work better? And it came down to digital infrastructure, like the thing that was preventing our companies from getting as big as we thought they could and reaching as many people, helping as many people, but also making good businesses, was that the connectivity in a lot of the emerging markets around them, you had a great founder, they were in the capital city, they were fine, but the connectivity around them wasn't very good. And so we started just trying to look at that. And I'll show you just something super, super quickly to sort of share what we saw. So this is a map of Brazil. This is a Giga map. So all of these dots are schools, all of the dots that are flashing, these green dots. Can you see that map, Katya? Yeah, the green dots are schools that are connected, and you know this map well because this was on that napkin. And if the red dots are schools that aren't connected to the internet, and if you click on a school on this map, you can see in real time what its connectivity is. You can figure out, how connected it is to the internet, and you can really see what's going on in that school over the last week or the last month. That's Brazil. Brazil's a fairly wealthy country, but let me just show you, if we look at a country where we were making those investments in Sierra Leone and we look at how many schools are connected, you see a totally different picture. You see a red world, a world of places where kids don't have access to anything, and you see a few schools in Freetown where kids have access to the future. And so really Giga was born from that desire to make sure that the entire world is green, that every dot is connected. And that's because, as Felipe said in the intro, there are 500 million, maybe 800 million kids without connectivity. That's an entire, when you bring them onto the digital world, into the digital fabric, that's like a much bigger change for global commerce than when China joined the World Trade Organization. I mean, there's a huge untapped capacity in that red world. And it just frustrates me so much that part of the world is moving forward and this other part is kind of stuck. So it came from a personal frustration, from a business frustration, and from a sense that technology could actually sort of help to solve this problem.
Amazing. Chris, so kind of going ahead with this technology discussion. So technology plays a huge role in your ability to do this. And you've mentioned, Felipe also mentioned, AI, blockchain, satellite mapping. You're using a lot of different types of technologies here to help you achieve this very ambitious goal. Can you tell us more about how you balance a little bit this deploying cutting edge technology with the practical constraints of doing this in emerging countries, underserved regions? So how does that work more tangibly, and can you talk to that?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think the recent DeepSeek events are the most beautiful illustration I can have of like how we've we've been trying to work in so many ways, which is that our philosophy has always been to be open source and to build where the need is. So the technology that we built for finding schools. Now, you'd think a country maybe knows where its schools are. In fact, most countries don't. The majority of countries don't know where every school is in their country. A wealthy country like the US doesn't know where all of its schools are exactly on indigenous land. A country like Colombia, when we got the data from Colombia about its schools from the government, and we used our satellite imagery and our AI to, which basically takes images from satellites, high resolution satellite imagery. We've trained models that are open source to figure out what schools look like. It finds schools, it puts them on the map. We found Colombia gave us 30,000 schools, 32,000 schools or something like that from their national database. We found another 5,000 from satellite imagery and using AI to identify schools that didn't exist at the national level. When we mapped the schools in Sudan, we found that a third of their schools were in the Indian Ocean because there'd been a database error. So the idea, the kind of coverage of where things are in the technology world isn't evenly distributed. And when we build technology, we build very, very simple stuff that's built all in an open source fashion. It's all fundamentally open source from end to end. It can be adapted by countries. It can be built in countries, and it's built according to local needs. So we're not building stuff in Silicon Valley and trying to ship it to the rest of the world. We're working with developers and data scientists and engineers in governments in Colombia and Sudan to make sure that this stuff works for them. And I can go into this in a lot more detail, but I think that technology well used is probably the only thing that can combat technology badly used. And we're living in a world right now where technology badly used is going to drive the discourse, the politics, the war of the future, the changing international landscape. And most importantly, technology badly used will impact poor people much worse than rich people, because rich people have a choice, a lot of choices. And technology well used is, I think, the only thing that can create a bit of balance. And even if somebody only cares about capital production and creation and only cares about business, you don't want an unbalanced world. And if you are somebody who does care about humanity and advancing humanity, you know that it needs to kind of all come together. So the tech we work on is built by, a lot of it's built by our team in Barcelona in collaboration with our partners in now 40 countries. And we work across a stack of tech that's very hyped up. I mean, AI, this is not financial advice, but like the market valuations are probably not exactly where they should be in a lot of these things. Blockchain went through its huge hype cycles, going through and again now. But we work with the fundamentals of those technologies because at the core, if you take up off all the onion layers of hype and VC stuff, at the bottom of it, at the inside of it, there is something important about having a clear public distributed ledger that can measure where gigabytes are going, or having models that can figure out where schools are, or how networks are designed to make sure that gigabytes flow more fairly. So those are we try to really get very, very low level, be very open source, and build at the point of need, rather than trying to build a complete package or solution that is going to work for everybody right away.
Thank you. I mean, I love this quote. I'll say it again: technology well used can combat technology badly used. That's an amazing a way to see the world and to think about it. And one of you mentioned your partners. You mentioned partners in 40 countries. You mentioned scale earlier, and when you addressed the question, how are you able to create these type of partners? And I think there's a lot of people on the call as well who don't work for the UN, don't know particularly maybe the ins and outs, have heard a little bit, read about the UN in the newspaper. But how are you able to leverage the value of what you have created within the UN to create these partnerships? And I've seen on your website, you have over 15 partners now, multinational corporations, foundations, governments in particular. These are very different types of stakeholders. They have different ways of speaking, different goals. Some are global, some are local. And the problem that you're trying to address needs to take into consideration all of these people's goals, how they speak, the languages they use, and of course, this global local interface. So how are you able to build out these ecosystems as Giga, including what you've created within the UN and the governance structure that you're under now?
Wow, that sounds like I need a therapy sofa and a lot of time to get into that one. I mean, I have an amazing team. So I'm so proud to work with a team of about 65 people who are experts in technology, in GovTech, in how you work with these big institutions. Contractually, we sit within UNICEF. UNICEF is a very different thing than much of the rest of the UN. So without getting into all the gory details, the UN is a Byzantine system in many ways. There are several agencies which are entirely voluntarily funded, like UNICEF. It means the money comes from individuals and from companies. And UNICEF has about a $16 billion a year budget. So this is a large machine. UNICEF buys a third of the world's vaccines. They buy about $6 billion a year worth of commodities. UNICEF responds to hundreds, almost 1,000 emergencies last year. So this is a big, big organization with offices in 190 countries around the world. And so the rest of the UN functions as it does in various ways. They're technical agencies, there are other field-based organizations, but UNICEF is one of these really big ones that has a lot of market clout, has a lot of visibility, and has an ability to collaborate with governments at the highest level. So in a country, the UNICEF office, and UNICEF has about 17,000 staff around the world. So again, this is like enterprise, it's big size stuff. When in a country like Brazil or Sierra Leone, UNICEF works with the government and sets up a set of relationships between the Minister of Health and the UNICEF health person, the Minister of Education, the UNICEF education person. And those relationships help UNICEF advocate for tools, techniques, technologies, advancements for children who are otherwise left out of government development plans for whatever reason. It's a really important role. It means that in any country, if you break down the kids by economic quintile and you look at the kids on the bottom quintile, the bottom 20% of kids from a wealth point of view, they often don't have a strong advocacy platform. So nobody's saying like, you should really take care of those kids. You should vaccinate them. You should make sure that they get their food at school. And if you don't vaccinate them, then this is going to be the public health impact on your country. If they don't have food at school, they're not going to learn this is going to be the GDP impact. So being able to make those arguments and make them from both a moral point of view, an ethical point of view, because it's right, and also a political point of view, a commercial point of view, an economic point of view, because it's necessary, is a role that UNICEF has played for 70 years. We are a startup within that. So a lot of my team, most of my team comes from outside, comes from building products. My background is in building companies in emerging markets. So we're not coming from a world of politics and governments and multilateralism. We're coming from a world of sort of having a product. But I remember at some point I was talking about products and I said, this is the product they're building. And people are like, well, where is it? Can I see it? And I was like, oh, like that's the even that's the disconnect. Because for me, a product is a digital thing, a digital entity that you can create and work with. And so there's been a lot of learning, I think, on both sides. But if you can use the good things in a complex system to help it be better, it tends to reinforce that. So we work with the pathways. It's like the brain, right? It's like the little neuron pathways in the brain. If you can find those pathways that are working, you feed them a lot of sugar, they're going to want more sugar. But if you feed them other stuff, they maybe that plus gut health gets you to a healthy human. We've been trying to reinforce those pathways in the sense that if you can offer governments tools that help them do their work better, they then want to engage with UNICEF on more levels than they had before. Connectivity was never a part of UNICEF's work. UNICEF works in health, education. It's the pictures that you're familiar with. It's a kid getting a vaccination or vaccine drop. It's a kid in an emergency who's lost their parents and can't find them and gets reunited. Those are the things that UNICEF traditionally works in. None of those are connectivity. But by bringing in Giga, by bringing in the capacity to do those four things that Felipe said, but mapping schools, helping with ITU to plan out the infrastructure, helping to understand a government, understand how it can get financing for $100 million projects, $300 million project in Mozambique, big, and then helping figure out how to do contracting for a $100 million tech project for infrastructure. Bringing government those capacities means government wants to work with you more. And that builds this kind of loop of trust. So we work through the UNICEF system, which has these existing relationships. We fortify the little pathways in the brain that are doing the activities that we want. And we help UNICEF deliver better results for children. And I tend to think that connectivity and gigabytes are like vaccines for the future. If you don't have connectivity as a kid, if you are a young girl growing up in a rural area and you don't have that access, your future options are limited, much in the way that they can be if you don't get vaccines or don't get good health care. The ability for us to deliver that, the megabyte, the gigabyte at the right time in the right place allows a child to have a much better life, a much more well-defined life, and allows them to have access to opportunity. So get the information, they get the opportunity after, which is like, let's do something with that. And then choice, which is the choice to use that opportunity in the way that she or he wants to. And that's really powerful. And I think that that tells a story of a much more connected humanity than one where there's a lot of the red dots around the world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, this is very inspirational, but I'm sure, now that I'm also working in a startup and co-founding my startup, it's not always roses and pink flowers. I'm sure there's been, hurdles and challenges that you've had to address, particularly being a social entrepreneur within a bureaucratic system, also having to create these type of ecosystems and scaling and addressing such an ambitious project. Could you before we move to what the future holds for Giga, could you more tangibly maybe tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that you've had? When did things not go as planned? And what did you learn, and how did these moments help you move Giga forward and move Giga into the future?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we've been, and I just want to also, sorry, before I say that, answer that, I want to also, you had asked specifically about partnerships with corporates. I would just say the last piece on that is like, because everything we build is open source and it feels like a commercial product, but it's open source, you can bring in corporates in a totally different way because you're like, this is a joint venture. This is something that'll help your business or your markets. It'll help you grow. So when you get Ericsson or you get Dell working with us, it's not because it's only to do good things, although of course IHS Tower is doing good things by supporting us with their data, with their finances, but they're also building their market. So because the stuff is open source, everybody feels like they have a place to play. And I couldn't underscore that enough. I mean, it's the single biggest idea of our generation, I think, and it's again the DeepSeek event, whatever you want to call it, singularity of DeepSeek has really shown that an open source competitor can change market dynamics significantly. In terms of bad things, that's a whole other therapy session. But I mean, doing stuff that's new is hard, and you know it from your startup. It's really hard when you're swimming against a stream of things, and if it's something new, then people have tried it before and it hasn't worked, so they'll all tell you why it hasn't worked and everything. And I think that the biggest hurdle that we've had to leap over in the last few years is, and it's absolutely our own fault. I'm not sure that it's avoidable because when you're dumb and innocent, you don't necessarily know all the stuff that you should be smart about. That's the point of being dumb. But I start every project that I do pretty dumb about the thing that I'm starting with. It's a kind of like optimal ignorance, or I don't know if it's optimal, but it's just certainly ignorance. Um, so when you start off dumb in a field and you don't have that deep knowledge of it, you ask a bunch of questions that um, can definitely seem to people who have had experience in that field very naive, and they are naive. That's how a child learns, right? Is by doing kind of naive things. um, they help you create a space where you can build things, but they're very off-putting at first to experts in the field who've been trying to solve this problem for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. The internet hasn't been around that long, so like they haven't been solving it for longer than 20 years, but certainly in that range. And I think one of the big problems is the language that we used at the beginning. So I think we came off as very arrogant, and we came off as very like, we're going to do this thing. We're so smart. All of you people haven't been doing anything. And I think that was for sure not the right way to do it. And a lot of it was because of the types of questions we were asking. We weren't saying, you know, you're dumb and we know better, or we're going to do better, but we were asking questions that seemed to indicate uh, a dilettantism about it, or a naivete and purposeful naivete that were very, very off-putting. And I think so that was like a thing that, and hopefully we've learned enough dumb lessons to be a little bit more intelligent when we have those kind of conversations with people. That was one. Um, I think another one is that, and one will always find this, the speed of private sector tech innovation and the speed of public sector government work policy are totally, orders of magnitude different. And figuring out how it's like a gearbox in a car, you need a shifter to get those gears to work right. All of my friends, whenever I talk to my friends from the tech world who build tech products, companies, whatever, they're like, what, how do you spend your time in that government side of things? Like, isn't that killing you? Like, it's so slow. And I'm like, yeah, sure, it is slow, but it gives you access to a whole lot of machinery if you can be in the right gear. And it's just like you don't drive on a highway in first gear, but you really need first for a whole bunch of stuff. And like reverse is as powerful as third. It's a very powerful gear, but nobody uses it that way. But like if you kind of know how the gearbox works, you can do a lot with the car. And hopefully not get too frustrated, and hopefully doesn't, grind the gears down. But I think that that difference in speed is something that we've struggled with too. And then the last thing is uh, when you work in 40 countries, and hopefully we'll be in 60 countries soon, the way that governments change. That's like the nature of a government. We're seeing that right now at a global level. Agreements that you make with one government don't necessarily carry over to another government. The the building these systems that are resilient to that type of change when you're working on a goal that's very clear but still has some political implications to it, is tough. And so I think that we have lost. There have been countries that have been part of Giga and have kind of gone off a little bit. Maybe some of them come back a little bit later. There are others that haven't really been, but that say they want to be. So I think balancing a global chessboard is it's a unique experience.
Okay, maybe ask you a more provocative question. How do you see the current geopolitical situation, maybe building on what you're saying with governments changing and a lot of what's happening now, what we read in the news, how do you see that impacting Giga going forward? How do you see that impacting the way the UN works and the way the UN works with governments going forward?
Well, I think that un unfortunately or fortunately, I think it's unfortunate that multilateralism is dead. So uh, and again, I didn't come into this as a political scientist or as like a person. I wasn't from the UN system or the multilateral system. I wasn't heavily invested in that world. But it's pretty clear that like the bells are ringing, and they're not. It's not celebration bells on a sort of era of a world that's connected from an institutional level. Um, you see this in rising defense budgets, on internal focus of countries, and on very explicit like budgetary cuts and limitations of access for the UN. So I think if you look at it from a trend and a data point of view, with no emotion in it, like you would short the UN system, right? Like that's the sort of market sentiment. Um, that's not great for poor people and for poor countries, I think, who need somebody to advocate for them on a global stage or on a national stage. Um, and I think that if you can find, I mean, my hope is that if we're entering a sort of dark ages of global institutions and rights-based sort of work, that during the Dark Ages, there were monasteries in Europe that tried to keep like intellectualism alive and keep writing happening and things like that. And so what are those nodes? And I hope that it's countries that support open source technology and open source knowledge, that support connectivity in a neutral way, that aren't caught in trade wars between powers that are locked in wars on multi-level discourse that really only hurt the poor. And so I hope that these pieces of light are found in places that can make a real stand for openness, for transparency, and for technology that can be owned and built locally rather than controlled by one or the other or the third or the fourth of these kind of global gravity wells that are emerging. Because I think that um, just like in any biological system, you need diversity. If you have a forest with only one kind of tree or two kinds of trees, it really doesn't do very well for anybody else. And so that's my hope. That's my hope of where it goes. And I hope that through Giga, we're contributing to that, and through the work that we do with our technology, we're contributing to create that diversity, because otherwise it's pretty bleak.
Building on what you're saying here with the nodes and using open source technology and coming back a little bit to this private sector multinational corporations and how perhaps they can step in a little bit into this gap that we're seeing that's being created. You are a very interesting individual with your skills, that you do understand the gearbox and the different shifts and the different speeds that companies versus the UN versus foundations versus governments can take and can move in. What advice would you give to somebody who's maybe not as well versed in the different gears of that gearbox, to potentially work with an entity like Giga to help fill that gap if they're coming from private sector, maybe not so open to open source yet, what could you see as a way for them to start pushing their skill sets, maybe pushing their organizations to start working with you and to fill those gaps with you?
I mean, I think when you're talking about dealing with big institutions like governments that do many billions of dollars of procurement, you have to be at the same size and scale as they are in order to engage with them. And so all of the little startups that want to do great stuff and want to be in this thing are tiny, little tiny rays of light. And then there's like a sun. And so how do these little tiny photons, they're just going to get blanched out by the sun. How do you engage? You have to be part of some institutional framework that allows you to interact at that size, at that scale. Now, open source is a framework. It's a governance framework for technology and for business. And by being open source, it means that you're automatically part of something bigger. It's like those, these with like the motivational posters where it's like a shark and then a bunch of little fish, and it's like if the shark's coming with a bunch of little fish, it's going to eat them all. But wow, and then the little fish join and they make like a bigger shark shape, and then they're chasing the shark away, and it's like get together, like what I don't know, it's maybe like a union. It's like a poster for unionization. Maybe it's not motivational, but it's like advocate together and like fight the sharks. Open source allows you to be that bigger fish because you're part of something much larger than you are. That's why you're part of a larger research community, whatever. So that's one way. Another way is to be rolled up into something bigger. Like, how do you get a government procurement contract? It's not going to be as a small individual thing. The UNICEF Venture Fund that we set up allowed companies that we funded to be part of UNICEF procurement. So then they could be contracted by governments directly. It was not directly, but through UNICEF. So those types of engagements or rolled up into a larger, company or larger organization. But those are the ways that like that's the gear shift. You can't, it's very, very difficult to go from minuscule to big. You need some kind of some laddering to get there. And so that's really what we look at as Giga when we're working with companies. How do we help these small things with big ideas become big things with big ideas on a big landscape?
Okay, one more question to you, and then we'll move to Q&A, because I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions for you as well. Gig has moved so quickly over the last 5 years, as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview. What is next for you? What's your next kind of part of this circle that you mapped out for me at the beginning? What's the next phase, and how are you moving into that? What do you see as the future of Giga in the short and medium?
So I think what you'll see is that UNICEF and ITU are picking up a lot of these pieces of Giga's work from the advocacy, from the procurement. There's some things that can't be done inside of the UN. We're building a system for connectivity credits, like a carbon credit system for connectivity. Those have to be done outside. So I think that this year is going to be a lot of externalization of some of the parts that we are seeing work, we're seeing kind of bubbling away, but that just because of how the UN or UNICEF, ITU handles finances can't like you can't have a marketplace for carbon credits or connectivity credits inside of the UN. So I'm really excited about watching that journey. We also have a team of 30 people in Barcelona, in the Barcelona Technology Center, building open source tech. I'm really looking forward to some of that being closer to commercialization, being able to be integrated into bigger platforms, like kind of to my fish metaphor. And so I think that really this year, I mean, we're also opening a huge office in Geneva. So there's a lot of stuff going on. But to me, the exciting things are these elements that will have to go free and sort of float on their own air, rise, and rise with their own energy. Or maybe they don't work, because a lot of stuff we build doesn't work the first time or the second time, or sometimes even the fifth time. So it really is a year of that kind of, there's stuff in motion that's going to be wonderful to be part of. And I'd invite people on the call to be part of those things too, because another way to engage with this is like find the things that are going into your space, the things that are technology, the things that are blockchain focused or whatever, and figure out how you can be a joint venture with them or engage with them in maybe a more normal way for you if you're in the corporate world.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I think this was amazing, and I cannot wait also to see what you guys do over the next year. I'm very excited to be a part of this. So now it's my pleasure to hand over to Tina, who will do the Q&A. I've seen a lot of questions already coming in. So Tina, over to you.
Well, thank you, Katja. Thank you, Chris. I mean, it's always inspiring to hear what is Giga doing. Every week there's a new like new news, new improvements, new directions. So, I mean, it's just happening at such an amazing speed, which obviously, it is not paralleling any initiative I've seen out of the UN. And I've been doing a lot of research on this recently. So, congratulations and thanks for these great insights. And indeed, in the discussions, you've already covered quite a few of the directions of the Q&A questions. I would like to take, three different strands here. The first one is about your pathway to impact. You actually said gigabytes are like vaccines. And of course, vaccines, this is the baseline for a healthy living, but we also want our kids not only to be healthy, but to actually, prosper, to thrive. So, after connectivity, what's your vision of how, we fight things like brain drain, we make sure that they have access to the right type of education. Do you still see this within Giga's mission, or how do you actually facilitate that pathway to impact?
Thanks, Tina. I still feel like we're going way too slowly, so it's really nice to hear you say that we're going fast. Um, so I also want to, as I answer that, I just want to also talk about what that impact can mean for like a school. So we've seen in schools that we've connected, we've seen so Giga just does the gigabytes, right? We make sure that from the national provision of where internet's delivered to the school or the health center, we're also working with health centers now, we're starting to do that, that the price of the gigabyte is lower and that the ability to access it for the school is higher. We don't do the stuff that happens afterwards. So we don't work inside of the school. We don't do it the teacher training. We don't work with the digital curriculum. All of that is done by UNICEF. A lot of it's done by UNICEF. They have a huge education team that works on digital education, and by the government ministries of education. So our role is really this early stage infrastructure that nobody really wants to do because infrastructure is super boring, but very important. However, we've seen in schools in Kenya, for example, recently we connected a bunch of schools, 1,000 schools in Kenya, um, schools that are connected immediately, even before all the rest of the stuff starts kicking in. You start seeing attendance rates double in some classes because suddenly there's a reason for kids to be. The kids are not dumb. The kid is going to school and there's nothing there for her or him. There's much less chance that they're going to go. If they see some, access to future, they're going to go. See attendance rates double. You see test scores went up by 10% just from having base internet. That's not even like having laptop labs or whatever. It's just the ability to be connected. And you see teachers are able to do something like 3 weeks of work in a day in terms of teacher, all this like the administrative work, all the reporting on grades. They don't have to go to a internet cafe somewhere far away, and actually they can do it all from the school. So we've seen these improvements. And recently we hosted all the senior UNICEF education colleagues here in Geneva. And one of the things that was fascinating to me is they listed in the key drivers for education change over the next year, because like education is bleak. It's a bleak situation globally, that connectivity was one of their key drivers. So I think that's really interesting. Where we see our ability to help on that value chain is all in the stuff before the school. So making sure that internet service providers have child safeguarding provisions in place, right? That's something that happens before the school. That's part of the contract. Making sure that the school teacher is able to deliver those that's another part of the system. It's somebody else's job. But we try to be at that early stage, making sure that those things are in place. And I think that even as you get more ubiquitous connectivity, satellites and things like that, the poorest schools are always left out from the things that they need, which is really good access and affordable access.
Yeah. No, thank you for this. Amazing. Another line of questions was around, how should we engage different sectors, right? We have this unique opportunity today to have really, cross-sector participants here from all around the world and very different industries. And obviously, what Giga does, the trick is to bring together all these sectors to work together. You mentioned the role of governments, you mentioned the role of private sector, you mentioned the role of the international organizations. So we often describe this in academia as an ecosystem, but in my books, when ecosystems work, you need to have an orchestrator, right? You need to have the one organization that's driving everything. Knowing a little bit about your work in the different 40 countries, you don't have the same approach in every country, right? It's not a cookie cutter kind of approach, but you take quite different avenues to do this. So who do you think is the best or most powerful orchestrator? So who are the types of organizations that actually need to take the lead and then bring everybody else together?
It's a really interesting question. I'm not sure there's one set of type of organizations. From what we're learning and what we see is that in a country or in a regional context, what's actually very interesting is that there's a new emerging soup that's getting created. So if I was going to answer that question like 8 years ago, I would probably say like you bring the mobile network operators together or something like that. But they're all going out of business, and they may not realize they're going out of business yet. They're like the animal in the last throes of its life. But that industry is got to radically change. The way that they've delivered content in the past is like it's not going to be the same in the future. So it's not that easy. It's not that clear anymore. But suddenly you have financial institutions who need connectivity. You have groups like Equinix, which like who's heard of Equinix outside of the telecom space? You have Cisco. I see a Cisco in the chat. In fact, our Barcelona center is in the same building as Cisco. So we're always trying to make that collaboration work better. All these groups that and like you've got all these AI centers that are going to need compute, which needs connectivity. So suddenly the whole landscape has changed. And Tina, it's why I'm so excited about this connectivity credits platform. Like, if you can figure out a way to bind all of the different players together in a single unit of value, as carbon credits ostensibly try to do, and I know all of the problems with carbon credits, and we can talk about that forever, but having a unit of exchange where you can talk about a fair gigabyte seems to me to be the way to build a platform that can bring together all these different players. Because that's why it's very hard to answer that question. You need governments and you need telcos and you need da. But the hope is that you can use a market to actually drive discussion among them or kind of consilience among them on this commodity, which nobody's ever defined before, by the way. So the price of a gigabyte in Zimbabwe is 70 times the price of a gigabyte in Kenya. And here in Switzerland, it's twice as expensive as France. So.
No, I think it's a super interesting topic. And I mean, there's no obvious easy solution to this, but I think the one strand is kind of building a market, right? Which I think you're trying to do with the idea of connectivity credits. The other one is also kind of where you said multilateralism is fading, it's collapsing and not working anymore. Kind of who's gonna take the role of bringing together those different players, right? Because we know that private sector is very powerful and has certain capacities and skills, but is not so good at actually, orchestrating these types of situations. Also because there's a lack of incentives, right? So, I mean, as Giga, you're a startup born out of two big UN organizations. So, will you have in the future the capacity and the presence in the countries to convene this, or do you rather see yourself as like a support to governments and providing the technology, providing the credits infrastructure at some point that would then allow others to operate more effectively?
Yeah, I think that a company or enterprise doesn't necessarily need in-country presence in the same way it did 10 years ago. I think the important thing is building your stuff locally so that it resonates. But where the domicile is a little bit I think a slightly different issue. One of the reasons that we're in Switzerland is that I believe that despite it being very expensive in Geneva, if you're going to have a serious foot in the door on global connectivity conversations over the next 10 years, there's nothing more political than connectivity. And you need a place that's neutral. And Switzerland has a reputation for trust, neutrality, and transparency. And I think these are, everything in the world is debatable, but these are kind of well-earned and at least well-positioned aspects of the Swiss architecture that are going to be super, super necessary if you want to be able to have these discussions globally in a commodity and asset area that is dominated by two big powers fighting over who controls the hardware where the gigabytes flow on. You need a neutral platform. You need a neutral positioning. And so I think that I think there's a strong case to be made for Geneva as the center of that, with its access to the international system, with the ITU being headquartered here, and with the ability to bring finance in. But if these products aren't built and maintained locally in the countries we're working in, it doesn't work. So in each of the countries, in the government, there are people who are working with us on building the marketplace. For example, in the 6 countries where we're prototyping it, that happens with the government and with local companies. So it allows us to be a little bit more like a decentralized network of, and Tina, I know you're super familiar with kind of how the DeFi ecosystem works, or the decentralized finance ecosystem, but kind of to be a network where independent nodes can build their own products, but they all sort of transact on a common protocol and common set of rails. I think that's the future of how businesses will be built.
Yeah, I mean, that brings us really to, another level, which is the new forms of organizing, right? So if, as a relatively, in terms of headcount, small organization, company, how can you actually reach that global leverage, right? And technology is not only the product, but technology is also the platform on which new organizations are being built. So obviously Giga is a unique example, but do you kind of draw inspiration from any other types of platforms, types of initiatives that you think you can learn from, or you kind of have analogies to?
Tremendous. I mean, like tremendous inspiration, I think, from several things. So one is there is a need to talk about the indicators of what we're doing in a way that makes sense globally. And that's where we draw inspiration from UNICEF. So UNICEF is able to track the changes in environment when a kid is educated, when a kid has connectivity, and talk about how that translates into results for a government. And so we pull a lot of inspiration from that type of real accountability and authority on showing that this type of change, which we believe morally and ethically is right, also translates into practical results for a government. And then on the other side, we draw a lot of inspiration from the blockchain world, the world of people who are building open source blockchain protocols and communities. Because even though it also sometimes, like if you listen to the kind of conversations that blockchain people were having 5 years ago or 8 years ago, it also sounded very naive. It was very obnoxious. Economists hated it because they're like, did you just discover banking? Like we've like that, or did you discover like philosophy and you want to put, so it was very discovery oriented, but now there's a lot of a sense of how these fundamental tools of like distributed ledgers can make transactions work better, work, more easily. And so I think we draw from both the sense of what a global set of standards can give you when you apply it well, and also the power and the energy of a decentralized system. But we know that those things don't come together if you're not collecting data from half of the world or a third of the world. If a third of the world is disconnected, that's why carbon credits don't work as well as they're supposed to, right? Because like the most valuable carbon credits you can buy are from the richest places, because that's where you get the best data and it's the most true and the most fortified. And the poor farmer in the middle of nowhere who has no IoT device plugged in and can't really like validate his or her thing doesn't really get value from it. And how are you going to pay them anyway? And so if all of those nodes are connected and they're all kind of pulsing green, then you can start moving money across them. And then it becomes a fair kind of system. You don't have this enormous arbitrage of people who aren't connected. And so I think while we draw inspiration from these two, we really believe that there's a space that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago where we can talk about a much healthier network in terms of how it's built. A human network, I'm not talking about the technological one.
No, I mean that's super inspirational, and I just really, when we think about new forms of organizing and how they will develop in the future, and how can we bring together different sectors and make a real impact, I think this is really important to think a little bit outside the box, or think a lot outside the box, how these types of organizations can actually look like. Maybe as a last point, I wanted to come back to the Geneva location. There was also some kind of eyebrows raised in the chat, like why the hell Geneva? Because it's an expensive city. Of course, there are lots of UN organizations. I mean, of course, we are very happy to have you here, but you mentioned this kind of diplomacy strength of Geneva as well. But obviously, Geneva is not a tech place, right? So how do you actually make sure you help, also with your presence here, you tap into both, the diplomacy skills and, this idea of it's not only kind of the traditional way of diplomacy that we nurture here, but also the question of, data ethics, how do we actually deal with guidelines, with regulations on this for the future. But certainly we're not a kind of very entrepreneurial tech hub, right? This is very nascent in Geneva, and there's certainly better place in the world to do this. So how can we bring those skills together? What can you do as an organization to tap into those skills, and maybe to even help the locations where you are headquartered, Barcelona and Geneva, to combine the two?
Yeah, and I really, it says headquarters, but I don't like that word, especially now that we're learning that like the gut actually controls the brain in terms of what you eat and how it sends signals up your nervous system. So I don't know if I want to be the headquarters of anything. I think that Geneva has a set of really powerful attributes speaking for it. And our presence here, while it's expensive, is substantially underwritten by interests that in the city that want to make Geneva a locus of connectivity. So we're not actually paying, you know, a huge price to be here. And in fact, we're gaining a lot from it. The three attributes that I think Geneva has to offer, and I would encourage others who are in the GovTech space to kind of give Geneva a second consideration. And I'm not an official ambassador of the city yet, but here's why. First of all, like there is this international system here, which is in a moment of real existential shock. It's going to need something to latch onto. I believe that technology can be one of the avenues that the international system can link to try to kind of keep that sense of connectivity alive, that sense of relevance alive for the city, but also for the ambassadors who are here, the missions here, and so on. Second, as you said, this ability to do policy and regulatory framing. I think the Swiss structuring and the relevance of Switzerland as a sort of normative institution in the global space is very important, and Geneva provides a home for that. And then the third is that there actually is a sort of burgeoning tech sector here, for sure in the blockchain space, not so much in the AI space, but there are several associations and groups and enterprises here. There's also, I think, a rich tapestry being woven with the University of Geneva for research into some blockchain work that hopefully will be coming out soon. So I think that this city, if I was a startup looking to try to get into the international space, I would probably start looking at Geneva and seeing if there are options where I could get some underwritten money, get some subsidization or things like that to be engaged or link up with some of these institutions. But none of this matters if you're not also building technology in the place where it's needed. And so like we spend a lot of our money to both bring technologists to Barcelona and also make sure that we're supporting technologists in Malawi, Zambia, Brazil, and the other places that we're working. And so I think that having that flow back and forth creates a healthier ecosystem, a healthier biosphere. And so really balancing that out at a corporate level like we do it's a trick, and it means you spend money on weird stuff that probably wouldn't appear on a normal balance sheet somebody would question it, but I think it makes us better as an initiative, and it certainly drives better products.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the great discussion. And I think that's also a buzzword to hand over to Felipe again. We're speaking about how we can leverage different aspects of innovation. This is also one of your topics of expertise, Felipe. So let me hand over to you to close the session. Thanks a lot, Chris.
Thank you, Tina. So we could stay here for a long time. There's a lot to be discussed and super interesting. Chris, I would just like to kind of take the final 2 minutes as I thank everyone for staying with us this morning. I mean, any kind of closing remarks? And what I'm being wondering, I mean, this video is not only for those watching us live, but it's going to be made accessible to the whole INSEAD alumni community and more broadly, different people, different parts of the world. I see that maybe someone will be wondering, how can we engage with Giga? What can we do in places like Brazil, Malawi, many other places? Any kind of closing remarks?
Yeah, thanks, Felipe. And again, thank you to you and the team and Tina and to Katya for being such a great interviewer. I think, when I was like a kid, I wanted to live in a time of change because I read a lot of science fiction books and I was like, oh, it would be so great to live in a time where everything's changing. Because then like you'd just like all this stuff open. And now I really regret that sentiment. Not that I contributed much to everything that's happening in the world, but I think that I think that honestly, the most amazing thing about Giga has been finding these partners who've never collaborated with the UN before. They never collaborated with UNICEF before, tech partners, like some that we've talked about on this call, who see a common mission and see a common interest in connecting the world. And I think it's really nice. Like there's something very gratifying in a world that's so fragmented and so fractured, and it's difficult to live in a time where history is being made, like a lot of history is being made all at once. It's not a nice place to be in. But seeing this kind of common humanity come through where it's like, yeah, it's a good business goal, it's a good personal goal, it makes sense, is really great. So we're very active on social media, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, X, whatever, on Instagram. There's a Giga account. We are around. We're happy to engage more with INSEAD and of course with the University of Geneva. And I think that if companies are interested in collaborating, please reach out. We have a great partnerships team that can help with that. We don't do a lot of stuff at the kind of community level yet, but we're going to be launching a big photo contest, which is our first foray into that. So also look out for some information on the Giga photo contest. That's going to be our first attempt to bring in some of the young people who we work with into this discussion. And so I think there are a bunch of things coming up over the next year also that we'll be posting a lot of, and I'm sure through the INSEAD connection that we're building, you'll also promote through your networks. And thank you again so much for having me, Felipe.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all. Please watch the space and connect with us, connect with Chris, with Tina and Katya if you want to learn more from kind of the team here at INSEAD. Thanks again, and we hope to see you soon in one of our future webinars. Take care. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.